as I'm sharing the tips I've learned along the way, and some learned the hard way by making mistakes, please feel free to jump in and share any ideas that you have or things you want to build on the recommendations I have here. So I'm going to share some tips and tricks, some useful tools. I've done some research on tools that can be used that may be useful to you in your practice and the pros and cons of them. And then common problems that you run into when you're hosting a webinar and the solutions for them. First, some useful tips and tricks. Before the webinar, it's really important to do lots of preparation and drafting an agenda, getting input from people who will be leading the call. When it's a bigger webinar, I like to prepare a script, even if it's just bullet points, so that everyone knows when they're speaking and when they're coming in, and to do a dress rehearsal with the people who will be speaking so that you can practice those transitions. The transition points are the hardest. And also just make sure everybody knows how to use the technology, understands where to, if they're speaking, has the right equipment and knows how to use the software that you're using for the webinar. Also, I think as women, we thrive at having plan Bs and always have a plan B and C perhaps. We often will have an email drafted and ready to send if things are going wrong, worst case scenario, explaining what our backup plan is. So you all might remember in January, we actually had this happen. We were planning to announce the Spirit Awards on Facebook Live and couldn't get the Facebook Live connection to go. And we tried and tried and tried and had to send an email out to let everyone know, change of plans, we're doing it all on Zoom. It's not going to be on Facebook Live. We will record and share out the recording with everyone. So obviously you don't want that to happen, but it's good to be prepared if it does. And especially now with more people using internet, the tools are getting stretched to their limits. And so I've been hearing happening more and more. Another great tip is to turn off notifications on your computer. So when you get a phone call, you don't get interrupted, as I just was. That's a good thing to do in advance. This is a great lesson. Another tip is to think about your camera. And this might sound a little vain or a little frivolous, but I think when you have clear, good lighting, good sound, it helps people focus more on the message and not on the technical challenges. You'll see I actually, on my desk, I have a little stand for my computer so that the camera is just a little bit above my eyes. If I were to put my computer on my desk, this is what I would look like, which is just kind of a different experience talking to me, right? It feels a little strange. So it looks a little more, you know, it's maybe a little easier to focus on what I'm saying and not look at my chins if the camera's a little higher. So just think about your setup and think about that. I always use headset. The microphone separates from the sound, which avoids that echo effect that you get in some audio setups. And make sure you have good light coming from the side, but not too much behind you to create a shadow. Another thing to think about is kind of leaning forward into the camera. You can see the difference that it feels if I'm kind of slouched backwards versus if I'm kind of engaged and leaning close into the camera. So those are just some things to keep in mind as you're setting up your setup for the webinar. During the webinar, few tips: arrive early. Make sure to welcome the early birds and be there in advance and make sure everything's working. Make sure you're transparent about recording. So, you know, for example, we shared with all of you in advance on the agenda that we are recording these calls and we'll be sharing them out. So everyone knows when they come in that they'll be recorded and the way that they'll be shared. It's important to try to get everyone's voice in a webinar, which can be hard if you have a big audience. So that's why the chat or the Q&A is a really useful tool. And a lot of these programs will have that option where people can type answers. So often in bigger webinars, we'll ask a really simple question like, what country are you joining from today? Or something that sets the stage or that's relevant to the topic that people can answer quickly and don't feel too shy. Once they have put their voice in, they're more invested in hearing more. So they're not just passive listeners, they're engaged and listening. So the sooner you can get people to put their voice into the content, the better. And sometimes that means you have to allow for a little silence. I know that's hard for me. And so sometimes I'll take a sip of coffee to make myself be silent. So look for tactics so that you can allow people to enter the space. It's not as easy for some to speak out as others. And so allowing for that silence, allowing for multiple ways to engage, whether it's through text or through voice or whatever it is a great way. A lot of webinar tools will have polls, and that's a great way to grab people's engagement because they just have to click a button and they're not feeling like their name is attached to the answer, and which can feel uncomfortable sometimes. And I always like to make webinars fun. When you're on a screen, it can feel very flat. It could feel very programmed. And so finding ways to be, even if it's just joy or doing something silly, as we know in World Pulse, we'll often have everyone unmute and do a cheer at the end and hold our hands in the shape of a heart as a way to build a shared symbol and celebration together. And so that's always something good to weave into the webinars when you can. More tips during the webinar. Thinking about how you're reinforcing community. How are you listening to the questions that are coming in and giving space to those? Letting other people share input throughout the time, which reminds me, I should check the chat right now and see how people are, if anyone has tips that they want to share. Welcome all. I see some new people have joined. I'm so glad you're here. Okay, so feel free to add your tips to the chat if I'm not touching on ones that you have. In addition, just thinking about how you can be inclusive, and this is something that I don't always feel like we do the perfect job of this, but we are always thinking about it. Figuring out the time zone, the time of the call that'll work best for the most people. And then there's always going to be some people who are excluded by whichever time you pick, especially in a global community like ours. So figuring out ways to include them. So for example, on this call, we have one really wonderful leader in Fiji, and the time never works for her. And so we've offered to make sure she knows the agenda in advance and can send any talking points or things she would like us to share with the group. And then we always share the recording with her. It's not perfect, but it's the best workaround we've been able to figure out so far. Also thinking about audio and visual support. So you can see Tam sweating over there because she's been typing. This is to support people who are having audio issues. And so always having someone who is able to do the best they can. It doesn't have to be a perfect transcription, but just a way to make people feel included if their audio for some reason isn't working, or if they need to see the information visually as opposed to through audio. Thinking about language accessibility, and this is an area that I think World Pulse really has a lot of room to grow, and so I do want to see us improve in this area. And Esther, I know you have been an amazing translator at other times for French, and thinking about ways we can be more inclusive with language is something that's a big priority for me this year. But thinking about having someone, who's transcribing and helping with translation support during the call, figuring out ways you can pause and allow for translation if that's appropriate, if you have a big number of people that are speaking different languages. And then thinking about bandwidth limitations. We all know Zoom uses a lot of bandwidth. Having the audio call-in option can help, and just thinking that through whichever tool you pick, making sure there's multiple ways for people to connect in. as a way to be inclusive. Then finally, holding space for questions. Try not to fill your agenda to the brim so that you don't have any space for right turns or left turns as questions arise or people come in and share kind of really profound things that you want to spend a little more time digging into. So those are my tips during the webinar. And then after the webinar, always follow up with the recording and the transcript. If you have slides or tools you want to share with people, send those out to everyone and remind people what is the action you want people to take. There's always going to be some, whether it's just, you know, remember the tips we shared with you, or if it's you want them to do something and that was one of the calls you were asking to rally around a campaign or to rally around a shared agenda, repeat that again in the follow-up. All right, those are my tips. So then a quick overview of some of the most common options for video calls and webinars. One quick note of distinction, there's actually a difference between a video call and a webinar. A video call is actually what we're doing here, where everybody's kind of on equal footing. There is one person who has the host controls who can help with muting and unmuting if there's problems. But you tend to have fewer participants in general. Usually it's less than 50. Everyone's kind of on video at the same time, so you're all sort of in equal positioning in the call. And when you share the information about the call, you're just sending the link to join. There's no registration process or second step to be able to get into the call. With a webinar, it's a little different. You can have more people. A lot of them allow up to 1,000 or some even more, depending on which plan you have. And the participants are in listen only mode. So you'll have a few speakers or panelists who you can see in the video, and everyone else is the audience that's in listen only mode and can only engage through a Q&A or a chat functionality. And to participate in a webinar, you usually have to register in advance, which can be a great benefit if you're an event organizer because you're collecting emails from people who are signing up to join your event, and you can follow up with them and maybe grow your lists or grow your audience as a result. But it's the pricing for these two options is different, so that's why I wanted to call out the differences between those two. So some common video call tools. Zoom, this is the one we're using here. With a free account, you can have up to 100 people on a call for 40 minutes at a time. And if it's a one-on-one call, you have unlimited time. It gives you the ability to record, save your recordings, but there have been some pretty serious privacy and safety concerns that have been aired very publicly recently. Zoom has made some changes, but there's a lot of people calling for people not to use Zoom anymore. So that's something to consider. Skype is another option. You can have 50 participants. People do need to download the program to their computer, Skype, and have an account to join. WhatsApp, we all know and use. It's very widespread, and it does allow for encryption, though it is owned by Facebook, which presents some security, safety concerns for many. Video calls on WhatsApp only allow up to 4 participants, and it uses your data on your phone to make the call. And then Google Hangouts is another free video calling option that allows 25 people at a time on video, 150 without video. And it's pretty easy to use in your browser. It works better if you have the Google browser, Chrome, which some people don't like because of data and sharing data with Google, something to consider. So those are an overview of some of the most popular video call options. And then for webinar options, Zoom also has a webinar platform that costs a little bit more, but it allows you all those features I mentioned, and noting the data security challenges with the webinar platform as well. GoToWebinar is another tool that you can consider. A lot of these will have free trials, and so it's something to consider. Zoho is another tool that's one of the more inexpensive options. So it's something to look at. There's a 14-day free trial, and with the basic plan at $15 a month, you can have 25 participants on a webinar. And then Adobe Connect is mostly used in like classrooms and educational trainings. It's a pretty robust platform, and I apologize, my slide is getting cut off here, but it's fairly pricey. It's about $150 a month for the bigger, the starter webinar version, but it does right now in these times offer a 90-day free trial. So that's a nice feature. And it's really good for educational, you know, when you have graphics that you want to share, walk people through, it's a good platform for that. So just sharing the different options. This is Zoom. You can see the range for the different meeting options and webinar options. GoToWebinar is a little bit pricier for the webinars. This is Zoho, which you can see is a bit more cost effective. I read some reviews that said the recordings aren't as high quality on this one, but it's a good low price option if you're interested. And then this is the Adobe pricing packages. This is the webinar where webinar information starts. So something to consider if you're looking at tools. Okay, so common problems. Often there will be audio issues where you hear an echo. This happens when your microphone that you're using is picking up the sound that's coming from the meeting. And so if you use headphones, that eliminates that issue because the sound comes through to your ears and the microphone can't hear it. But if you're broadcasting from your computer and your microphone is separate from it, it can create an echo effect that's really hard to understand the speaker. So the solutions are to use headphones, to push the mute button. And if you have multiple people in the room that are all logged into the same meeting, make sure only one person has their audio and speakers turned on. And I'll just pause to see if anyone, oh, WebEx. Yeah, Selma is sharing WebEx is another great webinar tool. That's true. That is a good one to look into for people in the market. Okay. I heard recently that WebEx uses the Adobe Flash, and that's going to be discontinued in 2020. So you might check into that to see if that's true. I was reading reviews and that came up, so that's why I didn't put WebEx on my list. So check into that if you're considering WebEx. It could be that my information is wrong. Another common problem is that the screen will freeze or sound cuts out. This will happen when a speaker is losing their internet connectivity or they're having bandwidth problems. And so we saw this happen when you turn your video off. It'll often fix the problem. Your audio will catch up and you'll be able to catch back up to the call. Sometimes you can turn your video back on and it works. So that's a good little fix. Another thing is part of the, be prepared tip. If you have someone else who has the script and has the controls to be the host, they can just jump in and take over for you and you can tag team. It's always good to have two people in two different locations that have access to that login information so that you can be a backup to one another. I was leading a webinar once, and we had everyone leading the webinar in the same office building, and there was an earthquake and we had to evacuate the building. And so we couldn't lead the webinar. And so that was a great lesson to always have someone in a completely different location so that they can take over and you're not all evacuating a building and trying to lead a webinar at the same time. That does not work. Yeah, and so we've pulled these together into a little tip sheet that we're going to share out with all of you, a little simple PDF, so you can keep it handy if you're interested in referring back to any of these tips in the future. That's my presentation.